I'm switching roles now. From a panelist, I'm turning into a moderator. I hope you trust that I can transform well. I'm happy to have to the left side the panelists and here the keynotes, and I'm looking forward to questions. Many questions.
Starting with the one.
Yes.
The first one.
First question. Food will not be served within an hour, so we'd better talk.
My name is Jean Frémont. I've been working for the last 25 years in Africa with Norman Borlaug and President Carter. And I've worked with the farmers in the field, and I continue to do so. I'm also working on the health issues in Geneva. What struck me always when we get to IP and open sources questions is that the fundamental, which is the economic dimension, is just mentioned en passant. In the end, what IP is for is to gather the funding to do research. And finance has a cost, and we forget that. And I will not enter the question of the complexity of modern research and what used to be called pre-competitive research about 20 years ago. But I would like to just to ask whether the funding for research is to come from IP, or is it to come from taxpayer money? Because in the end, that's what it's all about. Where is the money coming from? It's not going to be philanthropy. It has to come from a place. As you know, states are broken. Philanthropy has its limits. Therefore, only the economy will provide funding to cover the cost of research. Therefore, the system of IP is the system which will provide the funding. The question you can ask is the amount of funding needed, the percent of the royalties. But in the end, you have to be clear. Do you want that to come from all our pockets, or do you want to come from IP? Thank you.
I think that's a very interesting and challenging question, and I'm sure that each and every one here in the panel would like to respond to that question. But I would like to invite Michael Koch to kick off.
Yeah, thank you, Gretchen. Well, maybe I kick off by sharing an experience I had recently in a larger discussion around IP and especially plant variety protection in Africa. There was then a challenge coming from some NGOs saying, well, each country should have the right to have their own systems and developing countries should have less rights and less protection. But then in the end, there was a breeder from Kenya standing up and saying, listen, without having some protection for my varieties, I would never have made the investment. We as breeders, if we want to develop varieties which are locally adapted to our needs, we need to have some kind of robust system, and having less than the developed countries will not get us anywhere. So I fully agree, unless we find some ways of public funding, which I also don't see coming in times of financial crisis, we need to ensure that investment in innovation, in breeding, have some return. And without intellectual property, it will be very difficult because these products are so easy to copy and propagate.
Can I invite Larry to respond? Because this is the kind of business perspective.
Well, first I would say there's ample evidence that you need both types of resources. Obviously, the world that I walk around in mostly, although we do have IPR, that is the product of some of the government-funded sources, certainly. But the area we walk around in mostly is not unlike the one that Michael described, which is that commercialization requires protection in order to create the necessary incentives for people to make the investment into these new innovations that will get them back their investment and allow them to invest more. And in the world we walk around in, that's certainly the normal quid pro quo that is at play. There's got to be incentive. People develop in response to incentive. It's just human nature. Now, obviously, there are other developments that occur by virtue of commonly funded resources. Some of those are the get IPR protection, some don't. But I think you need both. But again, where we come from, an incentive is still necessary, or this kind of innovation dries up eventually.
Andrew, do you have any out-of-the-box response to this question?
I believe in both. Virtually any way you can get money to do R&D is a good approach. And I've had the pleasure of working with a number of different groups. I've worked for major biopharmaceutical companies where we protected everything vigorously, and that is one model that works very well for being able to do some areas of R&D. Of course, public funding generates a broad amount of R&D globally that feeds into these pipelines. What I've seen emerging in the startup cultures in the Bay Area, which often drives a lot of new types of investment schemes, though, it's starting to shift because the cost of starting a biotech company today is falling in much the same way as the cost of starting a computer company fell over the last 15 years. It used to cost $20 million to set up a computer company as you had to build all the architectures. And then it dropped to $2 million because there was a lot of shared architectures available that you didn't have to build. And today with biofabs, basically with cloud computing, you can start a software company in your bedroom. And we've seen evidence of this a number of times, Facebook being one that was started in a dorm room. I think some of those dynamics are starting to come into life science. And I think this will change some of the investment flavors. And certainly I gave one example of the Indiegogo, which is starting to pull in a few $100,000 for biological R&D projects, enough to seed a pretty interesting R&D project. More than that, it's engaging the actual people that will be part of the project, donating, in this case, their microbes for analysis. Something that would be difficult to do in a more proprietary setting, and even in an academic research setting where you might have to go and get ethics boards approvals. So I think direct-to-consumer investing and direct-to-consumer medicine and development is being a disruptor in some of these areas. But really, that opens up new avenues for investment and new opportunities and perhaps even new licensing models.
Other members of the panel want to add? Alex?
I agree, Andrew, with what you're saying, that both sources are highly welcome. I also think it depends a little bit on whether we're talking about the developed world or the developing world. I think there'll be a lot of public funding, more public funding in the more emerging markets. At least that's what we see today. When you go to a developed market, I like to use France as an example, to create one of the most commoditized products you can imagine, which is yellow dent corn. French farmers have access to more than 500 different varieties at any given year. And now those 500 varieties aren't created by public funding. They're all created by plant breeders, professional plant breeders. So they all need to make sufficient return on selling those 500 varieties. And that is, of course, protected by all sorts of different intellectual property. And I think that's very common in the more developed world. So I think we have to run these systems in parallel and use these funds in parallel.
We may come back to this, but I would like to turn back to the audience. And yes.
I'm Barry Martin from Syngenta. Worked in the industry for about 28 years for different companies. But the question I'd like to ask is about the regulatory burden. And I believe Andrew or somebody brought this up. And when we talk about innovation, that's fine. How fast we can make products, that's fine. But one of the biggest barriers in biotechnology to commercialization is regulatory burden, not functionality. And it's an area that could use open innovation. Do you think that's possible?
Who would like to respond?
Well, I can make a first try. Well, actually, thank you for the question. In many areas, the regulatory framework is potentially indeed a higher hurdle for market entry than intellectual property. You can negotiate licenses with other private parties, but to overcome the hurdle of regulatory can be extremely hard and extremely expensive. We see increasing shift in regulatory away from a risk assessment to a hazard-based assessment, which is driving prices very, very much up. So indeed, we need to find ways how to solve both, how we not only ensure access to innovation and intellectual property, but also market access. That will require a lot of creativity, how to make that happen.
Any further thoughts on that topic?
I would just add that it's often noted that in the United States anyway, drug approvals can cost between $1 billion and $2 billion to get through the regulatory process, and then still end up in failure. So obviously, that's a steep slope for people to invest. That said, and this is more of an observation than it is in my capacity at MPEG-LA, but just to say that if some of the regulatory organizations might focus a little bit more on the safety of the product and a little less on the efficacy, that might loosen things up a little bit and take the regulatory curve down a bit. There seems to be a little bit overemphasis on worrying about making drugs available that could be very useful to people, not available because they're not quite certain how to promote them in terms of the diseases they might conquer. Just an observation.
But isn't there a different approach? Can't you observe a different approach in the US vis-à-vis Europe in that regard when it comes to regulatory?
Well, I think it's changing. Also, the US is moving closer to Europe. Europe is a very high level of regulatory standards. So I think in the end, it's not so different. Other countries, like for instance Brazil, in the plant biotech area, is taking a very pragmatic and very fast approach. And these days, it's a country where you can bring products to the market in a very, very efficient way.
I'll turn to the webcam because we have 2 questions from our outside audience. And in my intervention, I said that I was especially fascinated by the new Syngenta initiative because it's one of the first e-licensing platforms for profit which we can witness, and what I forgot to say was, in the plant biotech area, because we've seen other initiatives in other areas. And related to my remark is the following question: why didn't come up Larry with that idea first? So why not have patent pools and co-ops and licensing platforms in agriculture, so covering breeding innovations of farmers? Why has it not come up with MPEG-LA rather than Syngenta?
I can only add that the door is open. Obviously, it would require, as any of these do, a lot of work to make it happen. I think, personally, I think an independent company, MPEG-LA or another, might be a very useful tool for the marketplace in order to develop the kind of credibility that might be required to ensure that people feel they're getting products licensed on fair, reasonable, non-discriminatory terms. But it's certainly something we would be interested in if the opportunity arose.
But maybe let me rephrase the question. When we look not so much at traceability, which is the Syngenta e-licensing platform, let's shift to the initiative you have announced, which is the industry platform. Could you say something more about the difficulties it takes to set up such a platform and why it might not be evident that an existing organization specialized in electronics and now also in diagnostics could take the lead there?
Yeah, very good question, Gertrude. Actually, I can disclose that we had a discussion with Larry, I think 3 years ago or so. How could you bring that forward? But in the end, the approach we have chosen is to make it more, or to have this discussion first more within the industry. Because one of the most fundamental difficulties in bringing it to life, you need to grow some mutual trust within the different parties in the system. And you need to have this communication sometimes in a protected space to see how you can really set it up. And that's why I think that approach was quite fruitful. So there's a lot of around mindset, building trust, having courage, making steps, negotiating really balanced systems, which is necessary to bring that to life. And in that context, it was better to have it in a closed room.
Does that feed into your experience with diagnostics?
Well, and again, I'm careful to say we are not, we provide solutions to some problems, not all problems. The one problem that we seem to specialize in is the many-to-many problem. Many patent holders trying to reach many users. And again, to the extent that a platform were to develop and there were many patent holders that were involved, I mean, I understand that I believe Syngenta is trying to establish the credibility of the model, starting with its own, volunteering to start with its own strains and its own patents in order to get this going. And I think that's absolutely commendable. To the extent that other people found it advisable to join that effort and to cooperate in making a platform available to the entire market, again, I think a company like MPEG-LA would be very well equipped to do it.
Maybe adding one fact which makes the agriculture industry somewhat different from, for instance, the electronic industry. The parties which were engaging in the electronics industry had almost the same view on IP and its importance. There's a fundamental difference to the agriculture industry where you have some parties which are the proponents of the system and other parties which are severe critics of the system. And so there is a different starting point. And you need to bring the two interests together and to build compromises before you can have discussions around such a licensing platform. So the starting point is different. That requires also a different journey.
I can understand.
May I ask a question here?
Definitely.
Well, it strikes me that this many-to-many problem is, and the way you solved it, seems to be very similar to the multilateral system approach that the international treaty has taken. Or is it me?
Well, there is some similarity in the fact that it deals with many-to-many, and that, as I understand, there is some sharing of the risk and the payments back in. Right. I guess the difference is that at least in our model, we're not ashamed of saying it. We're a for-profit company. At least that's what our aspiration is. And we deal with patent holders who wish to get some return on their hard-earned R&D as well. And again, we're not funded by anybody other than every dollar that we are able to get in the door for a royalty. We take a fee from that. That's the way that's the way the company supports itself. There is no, it's not a membership company where everybody puts in a certain sum every year on a cost basis or whatever. So we're totally motivated to collect royalties and to disperse them to the patent holders who made this technology available.
This brings us to the next question, naturally. I mean, because the next question we received relates to the comparison between these platforms in electronics, in agriculture, and now in the music industry. And the question is, can we learn from the innovations of the music industry and charge for patents whatever that innovation is worth to the licensee? So rather than, I understand it not to be a question about the model, but about what kind of fees and the level of the fees which can be put forward, and can we learn from the music industry there?
Can I make a first pass at it? Well, I think we do, actually. When you look at the way we have set up traceability, then simplicity is one of the key words. In other words, not to have a vastly complicated payment system depending on what potentially could be the marginal value on each of them, but a very simple system with standardized fees, which is exactly, if you look at iTunes, one of the most fascinating and successful elements of it. It's really simple and it's very much standardized. So I think we've started to really look at these systems and try to learn from what's working really well.
Can you say something more about it? So if I would be going to the e-platform today,
yeah, so how we've
have
set it up, and I think time will tell whether this system is the best system or it can still improve. The way we've set it up is there are two types of licensing depending on the nature of the trait. If it's what we call a must-have trait, a trait that typically varieties need to have in order to be even acceptable in the market, then there's a simple royalty as a percentage of sales, which is fixed. If the trait adds significant value, and we've got one at the moment on the platform that does add significant value, which means a seed company that uses that trait can charge significantly more to the grower than it previously could without the trait, then the royalty depends on that value created. Now that's obviously different to the music industry. You don't have that differentiation between sort of a simple song and a value-adding song. But I think with these two classes we can get a long way, because it allows, and we expect a large share of our traits typically to land in the standard class, and only selected traits that are truly bringing a significant value add which can be charged to land in the somewhat more complicated class where we would charge depending on value creation. We think that's a relatively simple way to do that.
From what I understand, no distinction has been made on the basis of the profile of the user, whether it's big, small, or large, when they take a standard trait or an important trait.
Yeah,
the fee doesn't...
The scheme depends a little bit, and Michael, perhaps you can talk to the different technologies we've made available. So for what I just described,
but you were talking about traits.
I was talking about the native traits in our vegetables portfolio, and for those no distinction is being made, yes, whatever the purchaser is.
Well, to a certain degree, there is a distinction because there is a fee which is depending on your net sales. So if you're a small company, normally you have your smaller net sales, so it's a certain low percentage on the net sales. For the other category, the enabling technology, the fee is not depending on what product you made and how much you sell from it, but it's like a tool fee. You pay for the tool, mm-hmm, and then it depends on how big your company is. It's similar like you take a license for a Microsoft Office package. It depends also on the size of the company, how much you pay for it, so this follows a similar logic. But here we decisively don't charge any running royalty on the product.
So just to wrap up, for the traits, and I checked the internet and there were some 4 yesterday, so you have a standard price disregarding who the purchaser is. And for the enabling technologies, yesterday there were some 50, maybe today 51, I don't know, didn't check. There might be some variation which is based on the fact whether you're small, large, or
but
big entity.
It's predefined categories, so everybody who's looking there can count his number of employees and knows where he would fit, and it's free for academics and non-profit institutes.
Thank you. Any further thoughts on this mechanism?
I would just add, from hearing this and knowing the issues that are important to us when we price various products with patent holders, I hear 2 things coming out. One, simplicity, mm-hmm, has to be understandable. And second, we always look upon ourselves as pricing to a mass market. You have to make this affordable. And the idea is that you make up in mass what in mass you may generate more revenue, mm-hmm, frankly, than you would in a bunch of bilateral type of licensing deals. So those 2 factors are very important in any pricing venture.
And I would just add one thing that I think is interesting hearing this discussion that I just want to say I think is valuable, which is the self-description undertaken to identify those standard traits and also the value add, which brings, I think, a much needed sense of transparency so that all IP is not all IP. There is a recognition, which I think has collateral and ripple effects, and at scale will have much more benefit to the larger sort of conversation around innovation and the role of IP, because the company is taking on itself that identification internally, which is something that I think can only, at scale, hopefully be beneficial to the dialogue.
The in-house audience again. Oh, whoa, whoa, 4. I will go from here, the lady just in front of me. Yes?
Thanks for this very interesting discussion. I'm Caroline Doman, and I work for an NGO based in Geneva, the Quaker United Nations office. And we've been working on intellectual property and agriculture issues for quite some time. And this has really been, I have been really enjoyed hearing these very different perspectives. And I have 2 related questions. One is several of the, particularly the earlier keynote speakers, talked about how we're moving towards this new model of sharing, collaborative development. And I suppose my question is, surely in agriculture, this is not a new thing, but rather an old thing. And surely in agriculture, innovation happened before intellectual property happened, and I'd be interested in comments on that. And linked to that is the point about the role of intellectual property. I think if we're talking about, surely intellectual property stimulates crops where there's a commercial market. I think many of the professionals in this field of plant variety protection has clearly stated that we only expect this to stimulate innovation where there is a commercial market. But if we're talking about feeding the 9 billion, and if we're talking about climate change, surely we're not, the main people we should be aiming at are not the commercial market, but the millions and millions of small-scale farmers who are not in the commercial market. And so I was wondering if I'd be interested in different perspectives on the role of intellectual property in diffusion of new technologies or new agricultural technologies.
Thank you very much. We'll start with your first question, which relates to the observation that open innovation is not new, but that it may well be old wine in new bottles, so to speak, especially in the area of agriculture. I'm inviting Shaquille to respond to that question.
Yes, thank you. In fact, I believe that's absolutely correct, that open innovation and the open exchange of germplasm within agriculture is by no means new. In fact, farmers have for millennia exchanged seeds and exchanged germplasm, and that is a practice that has led to precisely the creation and conservation of the genetic diversity that we today all build upon in modern plant breeding and in modern biotechnology, as well as in conventional plant breeding. So in that sense, open innovation is very much the case and already a given in the cumulative innovation systems of incremental innovation that occur among farmers. I would say that simultaneously, the need for ensuring facilitated exchange of both germplasm as well as the innovation that occurs based on the germplasm in modern plant breeding is of utmost importance for global food security. And there, the international treaty, for example, recognizes both farmers' rights as well as the need to develop open innovation and facilitated exchange both of germplasm as well as advanced breeding material.
Felipe, would you like to?
Yes, I completely agree that open innovation is not new for agriculture, but the new use of the open innovation is important for us. For example, in Brazil, we have a huge country with more than 5 million farmers. So how to deliver the new solutions for them, the new technologies? So we are using the open innovation system and the IP system not only to develop new technologies, but also to deliver new technologies. So it was important to us to have a stronger market, a profitable market, where many partners could be part of this, not only to develop new varieties, but also to deliver these varieties to the farmers. So in this sense, open innovation was new for us, was the way that we are delivering technology, and not only the way that we are researching new technologies.
Anyone else in the panel? Alex?
I think one of the things that has changed dramatically is the access and the use of technology in plant breeding. And if we go back a few decades, and particularly here in Europe, it's fair to say plant breeding has always massively relied on open innovation, with the breeder's exemption, with the fact that every breeder could take everything that's commercially available on the market and include that into their own programs. Well, what better example of open innovation is there? But what the difference is, a couple of decades ago, it would still take him 5 to 10 years to then replicate something that's only as good as what he started with, or let's say that's better at what he started with. So there was the innovator had the advantage of time in that whole system. It was open, but there was still a benefit for the one who found it first. Now I think let me use an example. It's as if you can buy a car and you can rebuild that car, but you have to take it completely apart and then put it back together, and then it needs to look different than the original car. So that'll take time. Now today, it's different, or it begins to become a lot more different because of the use of technology, allows you to shorten the time dramatically, to be much more precise in finding the things you want. So it's back to your printers that could take the car and immediately print a new one that's just slightly different and better than the one you just purchased. So that we have to recognize that the use of technology has dramatically changed, and therefore we need new systems for open innovation that still work as they used to do a decade ago or two.
Other remarks here? Then we'll turn to the second part of your question, the role of IP and developing countries, the role of IP in diffusion. Who would like to respond to that question?
Well, I can try. Well, of course, today we see in the developing countries very often different IP systems. And indeed, I think we need to recognize that certain countries need to have a different pace when it comes to intellectual property. But at some stage, these countries need to reflect also, what do I want to do with my local breeding industry? Do I want to foster it? And I think these countries can find a balance. For instance, you don't necessarily need to block farm-safe seed. You can also have mechanisms, for instance, where you protect the varieties, but where you do the value sharing after the harvest. Normally, farmers don't have an issue sharing value after they see the benefit at the varieties at the end. They often have an issue when they have to pay for high input prices. So here I think we need to become more creative in that space and see what can we do in the developing countries to foster a local breeding industry, which is really investing into new varieties, but still recognize that farming practice is different. And again, here I think we can establish system to use also one of the principles of the international treaty of access and benefit sharing, that the original breeder gets some benefit. Maybe not at the front end, but at the back end.
But I have a follow-on question. If you look at the literature of IP and technology transfer, so transfer of technology to developing countries, what often pops up as a really stumbling stone is absorptive capacity locally. So how does that play out?
What do you mean? Can you explain a little bit?
That even though you would be willing to say, well, you can have my technology, that the local knowledge capacity is not adequate or not advanced enough to make use of that offer.
Yeah, correct. Products as such will not solve the problem. So we need to enable, indeed, a much broader knowledge sharing and transfer of innovation. And here, I think especially endpoint or performance-based reward system might actually be better, because today parties which invest into the development of protocols get almost no incentive whatsoever, because knowledge, protocols, practices cannot be protected whatsoever, but they still bring some kind of true value to the growers. Mm-hmm. So I think if we look into this kind of integrated solution, and I believe in the future we will have necessity for more and more in this area where we integrate seed, but also farming practice, storage capacity, crop protection, we need to find also different ways how to share the value at the end which is generated.
I'm turning to Shakil to learn whether you've been confronted with this problem of absorptive capacity under the treaty a lot.
Indeed, there is very much so the problem of absorptive capacity. The treaty has several mechanisms by which it tries to, let's say, mitigate this challenge. One is by combining the non-commercial, what's called non-monetary benefit sharing mechanisms of technology transfer with capacity building. Capacity building and technology transfer and exchange of information are all non-monetary forms of benefit sharing that are seen as a package, that are an integrated process that is needed for both the transfer and co-development of technologies. And I would like to also underline what was mentioned earlier, that the mechanism that has been developed in the international treaty, in the multilateral system of access and benefit sharing, responds to the challenge of the kind of many-to-many exchange problem that occurs, which really raises the transaction costs of maintaining an open system of exchange and innovation. And the treaty, the multilateral system, does this at the upstream end, so far, initially, at the upstream end of the exchange of germplasm, of the genetic material from gene banks that Luigi was referring to. And the mechanisms that are now being developed very much occur, but in a way create the same spirit of facilitated exchange at a downstream level, again using what was used in the treaty, a mechanism of a contractually constructed window of facilitated exchange.
Okay, thank you. I'm turning to the lady on the second row. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Catherine Dubmer. I'm General Counsel for Enzazade. And I suppose my question is more a marketing question. I was struck by the sentence of Mr. Horn saying, take the market as you find it. What does the vegetable food market looks like today? There's a limited number of big companies who develop new varieties worldwide. I myself work for such a company, a Dutch family-owned company called Enzazade, which, like Mr. Torkas told at the beginning, spends over 25% of its turnover in R&D. We embrace open innovation. We license our technology to many parties worldwide. And about 3 months ago, we launched an e-licensing platform. And up to now, we had no request for an applications of a license. So my question is, if you are open, what are the specific challenges for our market?
Okay. That doesn't make me jolly. I mean, you went through the exercise of setting up a platform and you experienced that it's not working at this point in time, and you would like to learn why that may well be. Alex?
I'll make a first pass. Well, first of all, thanks for pointing out that ENZA has been one of the leaders in taking this same idea forward, and we've been working together actually between the two companies to make it happen, which I think for us is a great example of what we wanted to achieve with this in the first place, which is having companies of quite different background. If you compare ENZA with Syngenta, I think everybody would agree that those two companies in many respects are quite different in terms of size and heritage, actually work on the same idea. So I think we're setting a precedent here also to the industry. But I think it's also fair to say, as Michael had pointed out earlier, that the industry has started to work on this together, but with quite different starting points and quite different backgrounds. My take on what you just described, which is at this moment in time, no one has actually entered your platform, and the same is true for Syngenta. This was the official launch is today, but it was already known in the industry for a little while that we're going this way. I think that has to do with mutual trust that this really is working and this is going forward. I said earlier this morning in a press conference, success from our perspective is not to have 100 licensees within the first year. Success from our perspective is that the model that ENSA and Syngenta have put forward will be broadly adopted by other players within the next 12 to 24 months. And I think once that is the case, I think we'll see the licenses flowing. That'll be my view on that. But I'd be interested what the experience was when MPEG LA started this, whether you had the same starting issues.
We had, I'm sitting here going through my own history to figure out where there's commonality. And it's interesting you raise that. The first licensee is a very difficult one to get. Often, you know, you have to, it does require that mutual trust. It does require the credibility and the fairness. MPEG LA in its early programs had another advantage, however, which was the principal patent holders who were also using the technology recognized their own obligation to pay for it. So they got no free ride. They got no free licenses. They got no net licenses. They got no cross licenses. They paid the same royalty that everybody else paid, whether they were using one or more of the patents in the portfolio in their products. So that kind of got a jump start. Now, having been out there in the so-called wars, I can tell you that you know, first question from a would-be licensee was, are your own patent holders paying these royalties? And the answer to that question had to be resoundingly yes. That was very important. The second question, of course, once they were, was, well, who else that's not a patent holder is paying these royalties? And of course, that's where as I said, a lot of the work had to begin. It's not easy.
Can the reluctance also have to do with the fact that not trust within parties, but trust in the technology? So imagine this supermarket. You enter into the supermarket, and there's various items on offer, but you don't really see whether you need it and which one you need and whether it will work. So would there be a need to label the items and say, well, green one, this really works and this really works well for, and then orange ones signaling, well, works, but maybe not so good in? Is that an idea?
You go to a supermarket, don't buy this food, it may not taste well?
No, but I can imagine that stakeholders who go onto such a platform, once a platform becomes very big and offers lots of patents, it may be quite difficult for a user to figure out what exactly may be useful for him and what exactly may work for his crop and what would be not so adequate.
Yeah, I think I understand your question. That's why for the breeding technology platform, the native traits, we have only put technologies where we have commercial products on the market. So where we know it works and we use it ourselves. We have not put stuff which is in the pipeline and which is still exploratory and where we are uncertain whether it's value or not. I think
So they all have the green label then?
For us, they have a green label,
okay.
yes. I think there is potentially a couple of reasons. Certainly, I think there is something like a first mover reluctance, but I think also because so many breeders were involved and are aware about the discussions in the veg area around a global licensing platform, potentially they're saying, well, let's wait until this comes to life. We better jump on this one because we get more out of it. We need to, that could be one of the elements. I think one critical element of acceptance is also transparency. I think you need to make available and transparent and open what are the terms and conditions, what is the price, because if I, as a potential user, have to contact a patent holder and I don't know what the conditions are, I may feel that I exposed myself. So I think it is necessary, like for the iTunes, like for the other technology platforms, that you know without exposing yourself what are the terms and conditions. You can look on the agreement, you know every term. I think from our perceptions and what we have also tested with some stakeholders, that is a critical element. And I'm not sure how it works for you, whether you make everything available, but that could be a blocker in the kickoff. I think we need to overcome these kind of things and really become transparent. What are the terms?
Okay, there were more questions in the back of the room. There's one hand.
Hello, good evening. My name is Celine Krebs. I'm a student at the Graduate Institute. And I had a question, two questions, in fact. Throughout the discourses, we were saying that we need a new mindset concerning intellectual property to allow more innovation in order to share knowledge and improve living conditions. Concerning the debate, I was wondering what were the motives or the reason for Syngenta or ENZA, the Dutch company, to make its breeding innovation accessible? Does it relate to ethical concern or pressure from the IP system, lobbies from organization? And the second question, which you answered before, is there transformation in the condition imposed by Syngenta? You were mentioning the royalties or the need to be transparent. So those were my two questions.
I didn't quite understand the second question. Can you repeat the second question?
Are there some transformation also in the condition? For example, for a farmer who buys new breeding crops, you were mentioning that there are royalties, but are there also innovation to make it more accessible and to maybe lower the dependence of those farmers after? I don't know.
Okay, let's start with the first question. You have to open up your heart, your mind, your soul. What are the drivers?
Well, I think it's a mixture of push and pull. First, I think it's really observing that the currently confrontational debate can be really dangerous also with a long-term impact, negative impact on innovation and IP. So we want to set a positive precedent and demonstrate that we can have both. We can keep the IP system in place, but still move into openness. The second one is really a belief that in the future we need to have and we will have more integrated solution for many parties. So we need to enable that future and really maximize innovation. So that's coming from really a mindset and belief point of view.
Everyone agrees? So is it about ethics?
I think it's also about long-term business perspective.
To use a word which Shafali has brought up?
I wouldn't overemphasize ethics in that play. Maybe ethics plays a role. It's part of our passion for plant innovations to bring that forward. You can call it ethics, you can call it long-term business perspective. It's just making sure that we can fully unleash the potential which is in plant and agriculture.
Can I just... To clarify, I think the word ethics becomes loaded. And I think it's important to also not become overly attached. IP is just a framework. It's just one tool developed by a legal system, right? So the notion of the ethics that I was referring to, and I don't recall using that word, but if I did, is the idea of how do we enable as many innovators on the planet as possible to mix their intellectual capital, passion, expertise, and unique insight with the problems of tackling global development challenges. In some instances where certain regimes and frameworks, not just IP regimes, but frankly legal regimes, education systems, the kinds of capacity issues that limit absorption we were talking about, those can all be cast in some sense as moral imperative or ethical imperatives, but what really I'm getting at, or was getting at, is the notion that we can treat this as merely a policy back and forth, or we can see ourselves, all of us, from NGOs, corporations, institutional actors, and multilaterals, as players in the larger ecosystem that need to empower the greatest amount of innovation to tackle the scope and vast scale of the problems.
Could you then say that in a way the objectives of a company like Syngenta or ENZA, the treaty, all kind of similar?
Yeah, I mean, I think that in each vertical, innovating on our own processes and our own mechanisms is what is required. And so absolutely, I think if the goal is to say, how do we get a certain amount of knowledge out, concomitant with our responsibility to make sure that knowledge, once we just put it out there, isn't just lying fallow, but really reflect on what else needs to be done, whether it's the capacity building systems, whether it's sort of bringing up the next generation of scientists who may be able to innovate around that. Absolutely, to the extent that all those things are about opening and broadening the scope of beneficiaries and the scope of participants. I think we're all moving in the same direction.
Thank you. I'm signaling that there's time for one last question. Oh, are there? Is one question?
Thank you. My name is Catherine Hagan with the Global Social Observatory. This has been a very interesting discussion about how innovation is bringing about a major change in the cultural aspects of business operations. It would be interesting if you could sort of rephrase that and say, you know, what exactly is it that is going to be different now in how business operates that will distinguish this from the way business has operated in the past? And along with that, what does that mean in terms of how the legal regimes and the issues that are being debated in settings like the World Intellectual Property Organization will be changed as a result? I mean, I think there's a sense right now that what you're doing is adapting to existing concepts without necessarily bringing about a change in those concepts. And it would be interesting if you could comment a bit on whether there is, in fact, transformation going on in both the business model and in the policy framework that you are trying to address in terms of the way in which critics have been addressing it.
Thank you very much. That is a very rich and challenging question. Who wants to take on the challenge?
Should I take a first try on that? How will it change the ways of working, I think was the first question. I think the past was more or less dominated by each innovator was using his own innovation, and the exchange and the integration was rather limited. We very much hope that by having broader industry licensing platform, easier and low-cost technology transfer mechanism, we can foster really technology integration and avoid reinventing the wheel. That will make us more efficient and will cut down innovation life cycles. Second question, what does it mean regarding the legislative framework? I don't think that we need to make too many changes at the front end. What needs to be protected, how should it be protected? I think where we need to think about potentially legislative adjustments is around the framework around these industry licensing platforms. I think Larry can tell it from his past. To bring such a platform to life, to go to all the competition law, antitrust approvals in a global context is extremely cumbersome and extremely expensive. You can pay millions of millions just to bring that to life. I know that, for instance, the European Commission is looking into putting some frameworks into place around patent pools and licensing platform in the revision of the technology transfer guidelines. I think this is absolutely necessary. We really need to look into the legal framework when it comes to building these kind of open innovation and technology exchange one, because it's a very tricky area, and here really legislation is limping behind.
If I may say something, if I may just move it to the other end of the pipeline. I think Shaquille is much too modest to mention it, but for the treaty has been, the international treaty has been truly transformational in terms of changing the mindset around access to genetic resources. Now, whether that sort of filters through down the pipeline, maybe it is. So maybe some of these things that we've been hearing about are maybe not the direct consequence of, but have learned from the experience that we at the other end of the pipeline have been experiencing in the last few years. Certainly, it has been a transformational experience at that end.
I believe that if you would like to respond to that question in a principled manner, you come back to the question, do we need IP, yes or no? And I can imagine that most people here are willing to say, well, it's not one or the other, it may well be one and the other. Now, if you look at it from a more pragmatic approach, I can imagine that most of the participants here would say, well, from a pragmatic approach, it's probably very difficult to go for legislative changes because we're living in a global world and bringing about changes on that global level will be painstaking. So rather than attempting to change the legal framework, I understand encompassing the current legal concepts, we may be better off in acting through bringing about change in how we use those concepts and how we put to work the rights which have been bestowed upon us through the legislative framework. And that can be done through collective action in a way. Collective action meaning the stakeholders changing the modes in which their rights are used by putting an additional layer to it, by designing contracts or agreements which are helpful in designing easier access and facilitate development. That's how I would like to wrap up this conversation and this very rich and enticing evening. Thanks to the speakers, thanks to the moderators, but I think it's Alex's role to do that formally.
Yes, indeed. So the thanks are the role of Syngenta. So I'd like to start thanking all of you who have spoken here, who've first of all come a long way in some instances, in most instances actually, from almost the other side of the ocean. A couple of speakers here to come a long way here to join us, to give such enriching and, as I initially had speculated, thought-provoking speeches, which we all enjoyed. I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank all of you here in the audience and on the webcast. I said at the beginning, this is all in the spirit of openness and sharing, and I thought you exemplified this really well with the sort of question you asked to us. That was great. We look forward to continue to hear your questions, hear your contributions, your challenges to what we're trying to do. I think it should have become clear today we're only standing at the beginning here of something. Although it feels we've already achieved quite a lot, we're really only standing at the beginning of something, and we'll still have quite a journey ahead of us to bring this really to a good place. Which takes me to the next step here, i.e. bringing you all to a good place, where this is not just, there's not just food for thought, there's also food for eating. And hopefully more exchange and more discussion. So those of you here, obviously who are here physically in the room, I'd all now like to invite you to join us to a Taste of Innovation. It's right next door in the other room. Those of you who've been following us on the web, I'm afraid you can't join us, but we all think about you. Thank you very much.
That's another innovation.